The shuttle descended through clouds of purple gas, and Elias Vance pressed his face against the cold window, like a child seeing snow for the first time. Below him stretched the station world of Verath Prime, a place where the greatest minds in the galaxy came to learn and to teach and to push the boundaries of what was possible. He had dreamed of this moment for 7 years, ever since humanity made first contact with the Galactic Concord and learned they were not alone in the universe. Now he was here. One human among thousands of alien species, about to walk through the doors of the most prestigious school that had ever existed. The Galactic Institute of Higher Sciences had stood for 12,000 years, and its halls had produced every major scientific breakthrough the galaxy had ever known. Its professors were legends, and its students went on to reshape civilizations, and Elias could barely believe he had been accepted. But as the shuttle landed and the doors hissed open, he noticed something strange. The other passengers were not looking at him with curiosity or welcome, but with something closer to pity. A tall creature with skin like blue glass walked past him and made a sound that his translator rendered as laughter. 2 insectoid beings clicked their mandibles together, and one of them said in a voice like grinding metal that it was amusing the humans had sent one of their own, and did they really think it would learn anything here? Elias kept his head down and walked forward. He had been warned this would happen. Humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 15 years ago, and their method had been crude and dangerous, and nothing like the elegant drives the other species used. The Galactic Concord had welcomed them into the community of spacefaring peoples, but there was an unspoken understanding that humans were the newcomers, the children, the species that had stumbled into the stars by accident rather than design. The official classification haunted Elias every day. Class 7. Pre-theoretical species, which meant that humans could build things and make things work, but supposedly lacked the mental ability to understand why those things worked. They were engineers without theory, builders without understanding, clever animals who had somehow taught themselves to use tools they could never truly comprehend. It was insulting, but Elias had learned to swallow his pride. He was here to prove them wrong, even if it took him years, even if no one ever believed him. The registration hall was enormous and filled with beings of every shape and size imaginable. There were the Velithans with their bodies made of living crystal that hummed with thought, and the Cathari who shared a hive mind across thousands of individual bodies, and the ancient Sorvani whose species had been studying the universe since before Earth had formed its first oceans. A bored-looking administrator with too many eyes scanned Elias's documents and made a clicking sound that meant disappointment. "You are the human," the administrator said, and it was not a question. "Yes," Elias replied. "I am here for the physics program." The administrator's many eyes blinked in sequence from left to right like a wave. "You have been assigned to the remedial track," the administrator said, "and you are forbidden from attending any advanced lectures without special permission. Your dormitory is in the outer ring, and your meal card will only work at the secondary cafeteria. Do you have any questions?" Elias had many questions, but he asked none of them. He simply took his documents and walked away. The dormitory was small and cold and located far from the main campus. His neighbors were other species classified as developmentally limited, beings who had shown promise but whose biology supposedly prevented them from reaching the highest levels of understanding. Elias unpacked his few belongings and sat on the edge of his bed and thought about home. He thought about his mother who had cried when he left, and his father who had told him to make humanity proud, and his little sister who had asked him to bring back a piece of an alien star. He would not give up. He would not let them break him. He would learn everything this place had to teach, and then he would learn more. The first weeks were difficult in ways Elias had not expected. The remedial classes treated him like a child, explaining concepts he had mastered years ago on Earth, and his classmates either ignored him or mocked him depending on their mood. but Elias discovered something wonderful in his isolation. The Institute's archives were open to all students, even those on the remedial track, and they contained more knowledge than any human had ever seen in one place. Every night after his classes ended, Elias walked to the great library and sat among the towering shelves of data crystals and holographic texts. And he read. He read about the history of galactic science and the great discoveries that had shaped civilization, and the theories that governed everything from the birth of stars to the folding of space. And slowly, piece by piece, he began to understand how the galaxy saw the universe. Everything traced back to the Sorvani. 12,000 years ago, they had been the first species to develop a complete unified theory of physics, a set of equations so elegant and so powerful that every other spacefaring species had simply adopted them as truth. The Velethans used them, the Cathari used them. Even species that had developed their own science eventually abandoned their work and accepted the Sorvani equations, because they were simply better than anything else. It was beautiful in a way. One species had figured out the rules of reality and then shared that knowledge with everyone else, lifting the entire galaxy into an age of understanding and cooperation. But something about it bothered Elias in a way he could not quite name. He was reading late one night, his eyes burning from staring at holographic text for too many hours, when he found a reference to something called the Varenthal paradox. It was a flaw in the Sorvani equations, a place where the math did not quite work, and it had been unsolved for 6,000 years. The paradox had to do with dimensional bridges, the technology that allowed ships to fold space and travel between stars in moments. Most of the time, these bridges worked perfectly, but sometimes, without warning, they collapsed, and everyone inside died. Thousands of people were killed every year by bridge failures, and no one knew why. Elias read everything he could find about the paradox, and the more he read, the more that strange feeling in his chest grew stronger. He was not a genius, he knew that. He was not smarter than the Velethans with their crystal minds, or the Sorvani with their millennia of accumulated wisdom, but he was human, and humans had spent their entire existence figuring things out the hard way, making mistakes and learning from them and never giving up. And as he stared at the equations that had stumped the greatest minds in the galaxy for 6,000 years, Elias began to wonder if, maybe, just maybe, they had all been looking at the problem from the wrong direction. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the library until the lights automatically dimmed and then brightened again for the new day, and when he finally stood up, his legs were shaking and his mind was racing with possibilities he did not yet have the words to express. Something was wrong with the Sorvani equations. He was sure of it now, and somehow, impossibly, he thought he might know what it was. 3 months passed, and Elias continued his secret studies in the library while attending his remedial classes during the day. He learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut, answering questions just well enough to avoid attention, but never so well that anyone would suspect he was learning far beyond what they thought his species could handle. But fate has a way of interfering with careful plans. It happened on a morning like any other. Elias was walking to his Introduction to Basic Energy Concepts class when his tablet chimed with a schedule change. The remedial lecture had been moved to a different room due to maintenance, and the new room number flashed on his screen. He walked through the winding corridors of the Institute without really paying attention, his mind still turning over the equations he had been studying the night before. And when he finally reached the room number on his tablet, he pushed open the door and walked inside. The lecture hall was massive, far larger than any classroom he had ever been in, with seats rising up in great curved tiers toward a ceiling lost in shadow. At the center of the room, a holographic display floated in the air, showing mathematical symbols that shifted and changed like living things. And every seat was filled with Velethans and Cathari and Sorvani and a dozen other species that Elias did not recognize, all of them wearing the golden badges that marked them as advanced students. Elias froze. He had walked into the wrong room. He was about to turn and leave when a voice spoke from the front of the hall, ancient and cold and heavy with authority. "You there, human, sit down or leave, but do not stand in the doorway like a lost animal." The speaker was a Sorvani, impossibly old, with gray skin covered in patterns that looked like cracks in dried earth. This was Professor Kethvor, Elias realized with a shock of recognition, the most famous physicist alive, the being who had taught more students than most species had members. Every eye in the room turned to look at Elias, and he felt his face burn with embarrassment. He should leave. He knew he should leave. He was not supposed to be here, and if anyone reported him, he could be expelled. But something made him stay. Call it stubbornness or curiosity, or the simple human refusal to run away from a challenge. He walked to the nearest empty seat and sat down. The Velithan next to him made a sound of disgust and shifted away as if Elias carried some kind of disease. Professor Kethvor watched this with ancient eyes that revealed nothing, then turned back to the holographic display. "We will continue our discussion of the Varenthal paradox," the professor said, and Elias felt his heart begin to pound in his chest. This was it. This was the very problem he had been studying in secret for months, and now he was watching the greatest mind in the galaxy work on it. In real time, Kethvor raised one withered limb and began to write equations in the air, symbols appearing in glowing light wherever he gestured. The math was beautiful, Elias had to admit, elegant and precise, and built on 12,000 years of accumulated knowledge. But as the professor wrote, Elias felt that same strange feeling he had experienced in the library, that nagging sense that something was not quite right. The Varenthal paradox deals with the collapse of dimensional bridges, Kethvor explained to the class. We know that bridges fail approximately once in every 40,000 uses, but we cannot predict which bridges will fail or when. The equations tell us this should be impossible, that the probability should be 0, and yet people continue to die. He wrote another line of symbols and stepped back to examine his work. For 6,000 years we have sought the error in our calculations, the professor continued. Some believe the equations are incomplete. Others believe there is a force we have not yet discovered. I have spent 400 years of my life on this problem, and I am no closer to solving it than I was when I began. The room was silent with respect and shared frustration. These were the best students in the galaxy, and they too had struggled with this paradox. Elias stared at the equations floating in the air, and his mind began to work in ways he could not control. He saw the symbols, but he also saw something else. Something the aliens apparently could not see. He saw the physical reality behind the math, the actual bridge forming and collapsing, the space being folded and twisted. And there, in the third line of the equation, he saw the mistake. It was not a calculation error. The math was perfect, but there was an assumption buried in the symbols. An assumption so old and so fundamental that no one had ever thought to question it. The Sorvani who had written the original equations 12,000 years ago had assumed that dimensional space was continuous, that it flowed smoothly from one point to another like water in a river. But what if that assumption was wrong? Elias had grown up learning quantum mechanics, learning that at the smallest scales, the universe was not smooth at all, but broken into tiny, discrete pieces. What if dimensional space worked the same way? What if at the boundary of a bridge there were gaps, discontinuities that could sometimes cause the whole structure to fail? He did not mean to speak. The words simply fell out of his mouth before he could stop them. That is wrong. The tensor is inverted. The silence that followed was absolute. Elias could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. A Velithan student turned to stare at him with crystalline eyes full of disbelief, and then, to Elias's horror, The student activated a projection that broadcast Elias's words to the entire hall in glowing letters. The human says. The tensor is inverted. Laughter erupted from every corner of the room. Students pointed at Elias and made sounds of mockery in a dozen different languages. One Cathari laughed so hard that 3 of its linked bodies fell out of their seats. But Professor Kethvor did not laugh. The ancient Sorvani raised one limb, and the room fell silent instantly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every ear in the hall, "Come here, human. Come to the front of the room." Elias stood on legs that felt like water and walked down the long steps toward the holographic display. He could feel hundreds of eyes on his back, waiting for him to fail, waiting to see the primitive creature humiliate itself. Kethvor handed him a light stylus, the tool used to write in the holographic field. "You say my equation is wrong," the professor said, and his voice held no anger, only a cold and terrible curiosity. "Very well. Show me. Enlighten us." Primitive Elias took the stylus in a hand that trembled so badly he could barely hold it. The holographic display floated before him, covered in equations that represented the accumulated knowledge of 100,000 scientists across 6,000 years. He could walk away. He could apologize and admit he had spoken out of turn and return to his remedial classes and never speak of this again. But he was human, and humans did not walk away. He raised the stylus, and he began to write. Elias did not write an equation. Instead, he drew a picture. The light stylus moved across the holographic field and left behind simple lines, curves, shapes that any child on Earth would recognize. It was a diagram, a crude physical representation of a dimensional bridge forming between 2 points in space. The laughter that had died down started up again, louder and crueler than before. A Velethan in the front row made a sound like breaking glass. "It is drawing pictures," the alien said, "like a hatchling in its first year of education." The primitive cannot even do mathematics. Several students stood up to leave, but Professor Kethvor raised his limb again. "Sit down," the ancient Sorvani commanded, and though his voice was soft, it carried the weight of 400 years of authority. "We will watch." The students sat. Though their contempt was visible on every face and carapace and crystalline surface in the room. Elias took a deep breath and continued drawing. He sketched 2 points in space, then the fold between them, then the bridge that formed when that fold was stabilized. It was exactly how he had learned to visualize dimensional mechanics during his lonely nights in the library. "Humans are not like you," Elias said, and his voice shook, but he forced himself to continue. "We did not have the Sorvani to give us the equations. We did not have thousands of years of accumulated knowledge passed down from teacher to student. We had to figure everything out ourselves, from nothing, making mistakes and dying and starting over." He drew another shape, a representation of the energy fields that surrounded a bridge. "My species evolved on a planet where survival meant building things," Elias explained. "Shelters and tools and weapons. We learned to understand the universe by touching it, by breaking it apart and putting it back together. Our minds do not naturally think in pure abstraction. We think in images, in physical systems, in things we can hold and turn and examine from every angle." He pointed to the diagram with the stylus. "This is how humans see a dimensional bridge, not as a set of symbols but as a machine, a thing that works in certain ways for certain reasons. And when I look at this machine, I see something that your equations do not show." The room was silent now. The mockery had faded, replaced by something else, a reluctant attention that Elias could feel like heat on his skin. He walked to Kethavor's original equations and highlighted a specific section. "Here," Elias said, "this term here. It assumes that the space inside the bridge is continuous, that it flows smoothly without any breaks or gaps." That is the foundational assumption of all dimensional mechanics, Kethvor said. It has been verified by 12,000 years of observation. Has it? Elias asked, and he was surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Or has it simply been assumed because no one ever thought to question it? He turned back to his diagram and drew something new. A series of tiny dots along the boundary of the bridge. On Earth, we learned something about our universe that surprised us, Elias explained. At the smallest scales, space and time are not smooth at all. They are broken into tiny pieces, discrete units that cannot be divided further. We call this quantum mechanics, and it changed everything we thought we knew about reality. He connected the dots with lines. What if dimensional space works the same way at the boundary layer? What if when a bridge forms, there are tiny gaps, discontinuities where the fold does not quite meet itself? Most of the time, these gaps are too small to matter, but sometimes, randomly, they align in just the wrong way. Elias drew arrows showing energy flowing through the diagram. And when that happens, the bridge does not just weaken, it tears. And everyone inside dies. He walked back to Kethvor's equation and picked up the light stylus. The tensor is not inverted, he said. I was wrong about that, but it is incomplete. You need another term, a correction factor that accounts for the granular nature of boundary space. He wrote quickly now, the symbols flowing from his stylus in a way that surprised even him. He was not matching their elegant notation, not trying to be beautiful. He was just describing what he saw when he looked at the diagram, translating the physical image in his mind into mathematics. When he finished, the new equation hung in the air beside Kethvor's original. It was ugly. There was no denying that, where the Sorvani mathematics flowed like poetry. Elias's addition looked like someone had dropped a handful of extra symbols into the middle of a sentence, but it was complete. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Elias stood alone in front of the holographic display, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Then Professor Kethvor moved. The ancient Sorvani walked slowly to the display and examined the equation with eyes that had studied the universe longer than human civilization had existed. He traced the new term with one withered limb, following the logic, checking the mathematics. A Velithan student spoke up. Surely this is nonsense. The creature does not understand what it has written. Another student joined in. The assumption of continuous space has been tested countless times. This correction factor would change predictions that we know are accurate, but Kethvor was not listening. He was running calculations in his mind, his lips moving silently as he worked through the implications of Elias's modification. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the professor stepped back. He looked at Elias with an expression the human could not read, something ancient and complicated that might have been anger or shock or something else entirely. Then Professor Kethvor, the most famous physicist in the galaxy, the being who had taught more students than any other living creature, slowly bent his old body toward the floor. He was bowing. The professor was bowing to Elias. The correction factor accounts for all observed bridge failures, Kethvor said, his voice barely above a whisper. It predicts the exact failure rate we have seen for 6,000 years. It is correct. The room exploded into chaos, students shouting and arguing and demanding explanations. Some insisted it must be a trick while others stared at Elias like they were seeing a ghost. But Elias did not hear any of it. He was looking at the equation floating in the air, the ugly, imperfect, beautiful equation that he had written. And he was thinking about his father telling him to make humanity proud. He had done it. He had actually done it. A human had fixed the teacher's equation. The news spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Within hours of the lecture, every major scientific institution had received copies of the modified equation. Within days, it had been tested and verified by independent researchers on 100 different worlds. Within weeks, the first new bridge safety protocols were being implemented, protocols that would save thousands of lives every year. And everyone was talking about the human Elias found himself at the center of a storm he had never expected and was completely unprepared for. Reporters from species he had never heard of requested interviews. Scientific journals begged him to write papers explaining his methodology. Students who had mocked him in the hallways now approached him with something that looked almost like respect, but not everyone was celebrating. A faction of scholars insisted the whole thing must be a mistake, that a primitive human could not possibly have seen something that the greatest minds in the galaxy had missed for millennia. They published papers challenging his work, questioning his motives, suggesting that he must have stolen the insight from some undiscovered source. Others took a different approach. They claimed that the modification was so obvious in hindsight that anyone could have thought of it, that Elias had simply gotten lucky, that his contribution was minor, and would have been discovered eventually by someone more qualified. Elias tried to ignore the criticism and focus on his studies, but it followed him everywhere. He could not walk to class without hearing whispers, could not eat in the cafeteria without feeling eyes on his back, could not enter the library without someone pointing and muttering about the human who thought he was smarter than the Sorvani. Then, 2 months after the lecture, the summons arrived. A delegation of Sorvani elders was coming to the institute. They wanted to meet with Elias personally. Attendance was mandatory. The meeting took place in a chamber deep beneath the institute, a room that few students ever saw. The walls were carved from black stone covered in symbols so old they predated the Sorvani equations themselves, and the air was cold and thick with history. 7 Sorvani elders sat in a curved row facing a single empty chair. They were ancient beyond imagining, their gray skin more cracked than surface, their eyes holding the weight of thousands of years of accumulated certainty. Elias sat in the chair and tried not to show his fear. The eldest of the elders spoke first, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "You are the human called Elias Vance." "Yes," Elias replied. "You claim to have solved the Varenthal paradox." "I did not claim anything. I simply offered a correction to an existing equation." Professor Kethvor verified the mathematics himself. The elder made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been contempt. "The Sorvani developed the equations that govern dimensional mechanics," the elder said. "We discovered the laws of the universe when your species was still learning to walk upright on your little world. And now you expect us to believe that a human, a member of a Class 7 pre-theoretical species, saw something that we could not see." Elias felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "I do not expect you to believe anything. I only expect you to check the mathematics. The equation works. It predicts bridge failures with complete accuracy. Either that is true or it is not." Another elder leaned forward, his ancient eyes narrowing. "Perhaps you did not solve the paradox yourself. Perhaps you found the answer somewhere and claimed it as your own. Tell us, human, where did you really learn this technique?" Elias stared at the elder for a long moment. "You want to know where I learned to think like a human," he said. "I learned it on Earth. I learned it from teachers who had never heard of the Sorvani equations. I learned it by building things with my hands and taking them apart to see how they worked. I learned it from a species that spent its entire existence figuring out the universe the hard way, with no one to hand us the answers." He stood up from the chair, surprising himself with his own boldness. "You want to know why I saw something you could not see? I will tell you. It is because you have been teaching each other the same way for 12,000 years. The Sorvani developed a method of understanding the universe and then shared it with every other species that came after. It was generous and it lifted the galaxy into an age of science, but it also meant that everyone learned to think the same way, to see the same things, to make the same assumptions." He pointed at the elders, his finger trembling with emotion he could no longer contain. "Humans did not have that. We had to figure everything out alone. No one gave us the equations. We got things wrong constantly. We made mistakes that cost millions of lives. But because of that, we learned to look at problems from different angles, to question assumptions that others took for granted, to see the universe not just as abstract mathematics, but as a physical thing that could be touched and understood. The elders stared at him in silence. "You see the universe as numbers on a page," Elias continued. "We see it as a machine we have not finished taking apart yet, and sometimes, just sometimes, that different way of seeing lets us notice things that all your elegant mathematics has missed." The eldest elder rose slowly from her seat, her ancient body creaking with the effort. "You are saying that we were blind," she said, and her voice was dangerous. "I am saying that everyone has blind spots," Elias replied. "Even the Sorvani, even humans. The difference is that humans know we have blind spots because we have spent our whole existence tripping over them. You have been right for so long that you forgot what it feels like to be wrong." The silence that followed was the longest of Elias's life. Then the eldest elder did something unexpected. She turned to her fellow elders and spoke in a language Elias could not understand. They conversed rapidly, their voices rising and falling, and finally she turned back to face him. "The Galactic Science Council will be convened," she announced. "The question of species classification must be revisited. If a human can see what we cannot see, then perhaps we have been measuring intelligence incorrectly for a very long time." Elias felt his knees go weak with relief. "You are free to go, human," the elder said. "But know this, what you have started today cannot be stopped. The galaxy will never look at your species the same way again." Elias bowed slightly. A gesture of respect he hoped they would understand, and walked out of the chamber on legs that barely held him upright. He had come to the Institute hoping to prove that humans were not primitives, and somehow he had done something far greater. He had made the galaxy question everything it thought it knew about intelligence itself. 1 year later, the Galactic Institute of Higher Sciences was a different place. The hallways that had once echoed with mockery when Elias walked through them now hummed with a new kind of energy. Students from dozens of species gathered in groups to discuss ideas that would have seemed impossible just 12 months ago. The old certainties had cracked and something new was growing in the gaps. Humanity's official classification had been changed. They were no longer designated as Class 7 pre-theoretical, but as something entirely new, a category that had never existed before. Parallel cognitive species, meaning a civilization that had reached the same fundamental truths about the universe but by a completely different path. It was more than just a label. It was an admission that the galaxy had been thinking about intelligence wrong for a very long time. Elias stood at the window of his new office, looking out at the purple clouds of Vareth Prime, and thought about how much had changed. The remedial dormitory was far behind him now. He had been given quarters in the main campus, rooms that had once belonged to professors whose species had been studying the stars since before Earth had fire. The Galactic Science Council had offered him a full professorship, the youngest being ever to receive such an honor, and for weeks Elias had not known what to say. Finally, he had given them his answer, and it had surprised everyone, including himself. He did not want to be a professor in the traditional sense. He did not want to teach the same curriculum that had been taught for 12,000 years. Instead, he wanted to create something new, something that had never existed before at the Institute. He wanted to teach the human method. The council had debated for days, but eventually they agreed. After all, how could they refuse the being who had solved the Varenthal paradox? And so, a new course was added to the Institute's catalog, a class called Intuitive Physics that would teach students to see the universe the way humans did. Today was the first day of that class. Elias walked through the corridors toward Lecture Hall 7, the same room where he had accidentally stumbled into Professor Kethfor's class 1 year ago. The Institute had offered him a smaller classroom, but Elias had specifically requested this one. It seemed fitting somehow. When he reached the door, he paused and took a deep breath. He could hear voices inside, many voices, far more than he had expected. He pushed open the door and stopped in amazement. The lecture hall was completely full. Every seat was taken and students were standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. Velithans and Kethari and Sorvani and Species Elias did not recognize, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from curiosity to skepticism to something that looked almost like hope. In the front row, sitting in the seat closest to the holographic display, was Professor Kethvor. Elias walked down the steps to the front of the room, his heart pounding just as it had a year ago, and stopped beside the ancient Sorvani professor. Elias said quietly, "I did not expect to see you here." Kethvor's old eyes looked up at him with an expression Elias had never seen before, something soft and almost vulnerable. "I spent 400 years teaching others how to think," the professor said. "Perhaps it is time I learned that I was only teaching them how I think." Elias nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and walked to the center of the room. The holographic display floated before him, empty and waiting. But Elias did not reach for the light stylus. Instead, he simply stood and looked at the hundreds of faces watching him. "Thank you all for coming," he said, and his voice echoed through the silent hall. "I know this is unusual. I know many of you are here because you are curious, and many of you are here because you are skeptical. That is good. Skepticism is healthy. It means you are still capable of being surprised." He began to walk slowly across the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "I am not going to teach you new equations today. I am not going to give you formulas to memorize or proofs to study. I am going to do something much more difficult. I am going to try to teach you how to see." He stopped and turned to face them. "Humans learn physics differently than you do. We learn it by dropping things and watching them fall. By throwing stones and noticing where they land, by building machines and taking them apart and building them again. Our understanding of the universe is not abstract. It is physical, tangible, rooted in the experience of existing inside a body that interacts with the world." A Velithan student raised a crystalline hand. "How can we learn to think that way when our minds are so different from yours?" Elias smiled. It was a good question, the question he had been hoping someone would ask. "You cannot become human," he said. "I would never ask you to try. Your minds are beautiful things, capable of abstraction and elegance that humans can only dream of. But you can learn to add a new tool to your collection. You can learn to ask the questions that humans ask, even if you answer them in your own way." He held up one hand, palm facing the ceiling. "Let me show you what I mean. I want to start with a question. It is the simplest question in physics, the first question every human child asks when they begin to understand the universe." He paused and looked out at the hundreds of faces watching him. "If I hold a ball in my hand and let go, the ball falls. Every child on Earth learns this before they can speak. But here is the question. Why does it fall?" The students looked at each other in confusion. A Cathari clicked its mandibles. "Because of gravity," the student said. "The ball is attracted to the center of mass of the planet." Elias nodded. "Yes, that is the answer, but that is not what I am asking. I am asking why you find that answer satisfying. I am asking what it means to say the ball is attracted to the center of mass. What is actually happening when gravity pulls the ball down? Can you see it? Can you picture it in your mind?" The room was silent. "Humans spent thousands of years asking that question," Elias continued. "We came up with dozens of different answers. We imagined invisible strings connecting objects to each other. We pictured space itself bending like a blanket with a heavy ball sitting on it. We visualized particles shooting back and forth carrying force between masses. Each picture was wrong in some way, but each picture taught us something new about what we did not understand." He lowered his hand and walked to the holographic display. "This is what I want to teach you. Not the answers, but the questions. Not the equations, but the pictures that lie beneath them. The universe is not just mathematics. It is a real thing, a physical thing. And if you can learn to see it that way, you may discover that there are questions you never thought to ask. In the front row, Professor Kethvor leaned forward slightly, his ancient eyes bright with something that might have been wonder. Elias activated the display and began to draw, not equations but shapes, not symbols but pictures. And as he drew, he talked. And as he talked, the students began to lean forward, began to see the universe in a way they had never seen it before. The galaxy had always believed that intelligence was a ladder with rungs leading upward toward pure thought and away from the physical world. But the humans had shown them something different. Sometimes the best way to understand the stars was to remember what it felt like to hold a stone in your hand, and to wonder why, when you let go, it always fell. Elias drew a circle on the display, a simple representation of a ball, and he smiled at the room full of alien minds that were learning to see like humans. "Welcome to intuitive physics," he said. "Let us begin."